G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Well, I did record the second half of the round table discussion, and then I had a bit of a warble rant, and because I'm sort of used to ranting for 10 minutes, I actually managed to go past my 15-minute, 30-second absolute maximum upload limit. Therefore, I lost that video. Sorry about that. What we've got here is a swamp wallaby called Felicity, who has a joey in the pouch. This is, I think, her first ever crack at raising a joey. She'd be 2.5 to 3 years old. She's an infrequent visitor. She doesn't actually live here in the clearing, but she shows up. I'm pretty sure she was born from one of the local lines of swamp wallabies, because she's always behaved as if she understood that it's safe to be here. So anyway, today, the 19th of February, is the 75th anniversary of the first time the Japanese bombed Darwin. They bombed Darwin about 60 different times, and it was this 75th anniversary commemoration. Darwin was bombed by the same aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. They sort of came back from the Pearl Harbor attack, hammered and beat the shit out of Malaya and Singapore, and were coming down through the Dutch East Indies, launched airstrikes against Darwin. Don't know whether they captured Timor straight away. There was fighting in Timor, and then that carrier task group went out into the Indian Ocean and pretty much forced the withdrawal of all British forces between India and Australia and South Africa and Australia. Then they came back and they hammered Darwin again later on, and then went off to play in the Coral Sea and get their noses kicked pretty hard. And then, of course, there was Midway, and then things were different. But Darwin continued to get bombed by Japanese forces that were based on Timor, and I think Ambon. A little bit hazy on that one. But 75 years ago today, probably in about an hour's time, 2 hours' time, when you allow for the rotation of planet Earth and the fact that I'm Eastern Daylight Savings Time and all that, Darwin got attacked, and there were no Australian fighter aircraft stationed in Darwin. There were some reconnaissance aircraft. There were some Australian Wirraways, which was like an Australian version of a Harvard, only the back seat was for a gunner with a machine gun out the back, and the front seat pilot had a machine gun facing forward built into one of the wings. And they could carry a few light bombs, and Australia didn't really have anything else at that point in time. There was one Hawker Hurricane. It was stationed in Melbourne. It had no guns, and it was purely used for flyovers and recruiting rallies and stuff like that. There were some American Kitty Hawks, which were on their way, staging through Darwin. They were either on their way to Java or Timor. I can't quite recall which. But anyway, they had been in Darwin the day before the bombing raid on the 18th, and one or two of them had either failed to take off or they'd returned with engine trouble. So in terms of aerial defences, Darwin just didn't have any. And these Japanese, they were experienced. They knew what they were doing. Their equipment was at the peak of technological superiority compared to anything the Allies had, particularly in that theatre of operations. So, the wharf got bombed, the post office got bombed, the oil storage tanks got bombed, the aerodrome got bombed, and 200 and something people died, 220, 250, so maybe 260, because people had died from bombing on boats in the harbour and stuff. There were bodies floating in the harbour, and there were bodies in the mangroves, and Afterwards, there were stories that thousands of people died and that the government had covered it up. But those stories took a while to come out. Um, Probably the reason February 19th, 1942 is considered Australia's National Day of Shame is because the Royal Australian Air Force had no fighter aircraft. Australia had been operating under a Brisbane to Melbourne defensive strategy, Brisbane to Melbourne line defensive strategy. There were no reinforcements of anti-aircraft guns or artillery or anything to anybody who was on the western side of the Brisbane to Melbourne line. The idea was that they were going to defend the 1/10 of Australia that had 9/10 of the population, and everybody else, good luck, fellas. So the Royal Australian Air Force were told to disperse into the bush, and there's argument over who gave the order and how it was given, but how it was interpreted was that they said, run away, we're about to be invaded. The perception in Australia was that the Japanese were just going to keep on coming. They cut through the British Empire's forces and the Dutch imperial forces and the American imperial forces, just chopped through them like hot knives through butter. Philippines, Singapore, Malaya, everywhere. The American fleet nearly got sunk in Pearl Harbor, but somehow, miraculously, all the aircraft carriers had been sent out into safe waters. Lucky for the Yanks that, eh? So there was a firm conviction in Australia that the Japanese were obviously planning to land, because if we'd been in their position and if they knew what we knew about our defenceless situation, they would surely invade. They must know that we were defenceless, therefore they were going to invade us. The Japanese, on the other hand, they'd considered the idea for about 1.5 days, and a couple of lieutenant commanders were given the project of thinking about it. The problem was the Navy said they didn't have any merchant shipping to carry the invading forces. The Japanese Imperial Navy said they didn't have the Marines to conduct the amphibious invasion. The army said they were bogged in China and Burma, and they didn't have any forces with which to invade or occupy Australia. So they basically decided they were going to draw a flat, straight line across the bottom of their empire, more or less running from Timor to the Solomon Islands, and then go straight up north and have a bit of a raggedy edge on the rectangle where Russia intervened. But yeah, that was their thing. They wanted a rectangular East Asian co-prosperity sphere, and the whole thing was going to run on Tokyo time. It was a totally insane ambition, but that was what they were aiming for. And invading Australia was never a part of it. Bombing the northern ports and docks and railways, yeah, that was a big part of it, because what they wanted to do was make it impossible for Australia to be used as a staging post to attack the edges of their rectangular empire. But we thought they were going to invade. So there wasn't much of a naval presence. The army, some of them stayed and some of them ran away. A lot of the Air Force ran away, particularly when the second raid came in on the same day. Like, it wasn't just a one raid thing, it was a come and come back. It was called the Daly River Stakes because that was sort of the next railway station down the line south of Darwin. It was a race to see who could get out of Darwin and get there first and get on a train and withdraw to behind the Brisbane line. You see, some people didn't stop running. It was then broadened from the Daly River Stakes to the Adelaide River Stakes, then to the Adelaide Stakes. Some people were picked up as deserters in Melbourne and Perth and Adelaide, and quite a few in Sydney and Brisbane. There was a secret commission of inquiry into all of that stuff, and it took 50 years for the papers to come out. And if you really want to dig into it, there's a book written on it, Darwin 1942, Australia's Darkest Hour. I thought it was such an incredibly interesting story that I read the entire book to camera. So if you go into my playlists, somewhere in there, you'll find it. I don't know whether it's pontificating, warbles or what, but anyway, it's in there. That whole book read to camera. Staggering story. When it became clear that the Japanese weren't going to actually hit the beaches straight away, the army proceeded to loot the town. The civilians had run away, so you feel like taking an armchair or a set of crockery or cutlery or whatever, a set of bed sheets. The hotel's bed sheets were looted by the army and put on boats and shipped to their relatives. Truly not Australia's, not a case of Australians living up to their own image and expectations of themselves as civilised individuals, let alone a civilised nation. So, yeah, I think, as I was saying, there was only one hurricane in all Australia. It had no guns. It was only used for recruiting purposes. Everybody who was recruited by the hurricane with no guns was taught to fly on tiger moths, and then Harvards or Wirraways, then Ansons or Oxfords, and then they were sent either directly to England or they were sent to the excited states of Norte Americano, some working at civilian, being trained at civilian flying schools, some being trained in Canada at RAF bases or RCAF bases in Canada, and then they were fed into the Royal Air Force replacement channels to fight the war in Europe. They were flying. There was an Australian squadron of Spitfires operated with all Australian pilots. I don't think they had all Australian mechanics and all the rest of it, but it was the Australian squadron. Killer Clive Caldwell was commanding it. There was a lot of Australians flying in Bomber Command in 1942. Well, it wasn't until March, April 1943 that the first Australian Spitfires with Australian pilots stationed in Darwin took off to defend against a Japanese raid. And they managed to crash more aeroplanes by accident and getting lost than they lost through enemy action, and they didn't do much damage to the Japanese either. But yeah, anyway, in 1942, in February at about this time of day, there were no Allied fighters available to go up and fight with the Japanese. It wasn't until Douglas MacArthur was smuggled out of the Philippines and he arrived in Australia and he realised that the Australians were busy building an airport at Tocumwal with which to repair the aircraft that were going to be damaged fighting on the Brisbane line. And he said, well, that's a crock of shit. We're not going to fight the Japanese down on the Victorian New South Wales border. We're going to fight the Japanese north of Australia, start reinforcing Darwin. That was when the first anti-aircraft reinforcements, anti-aircraft gun reinforcements, and beach defences started to be sent. It was after MacArthur showed up. He was the first person to actually dispatch and station a squadron of fighters there. The United States Army Air Corps Kitty Hawks flown by people who were so raw and green and wet behind the ears that about half of them got bloody lost trying to fly from Brisbane to Darwin. Poor little buggers. So yeah, that's what happened 75 years ago today. And as a result of the fall of Singapore, which was 75 years ago this week, Australia has looked to America to save it from the yellow peril to the north. And, well, Uncle Spam didn't come and help us when we had to go and kick the Indonesians out of East Timor. We've been fighting Uncle Spam's losing wars for a long time. Now they've got Tronald Dump in charge of the nuclear football. The only thing that Australia gets out of being in ANZUS is that we have at least 4 atomic target zones. There's Darwin, Tyndall Air Force Base, and the US Marine Base, where the US Marines officially stationed in Okinawa actually spend 6-month sections rotating through Darwin, because that puts them out of reach of the Chinese medium-range ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, which can hit them in Okinawa. Pine Gap Communications Base, Northwest Cape Naranga communications bases. Those 4 places are going to get bombed by whoever the hell America has a nuclear spasm with. If we pull out of ANZUS, then maybe, just maybe, we can close those bases and we won't get nuked. If we continue to go all the way with USA, then we are going to share the fate of the Trumpletons when Fumdukistan goes under. The reason Australia didn't get invaded by the Japanese was because the Japanese did not bloody well want to invade Australia. They had no plans to invade Australia. They took as much country and took as much seaway as they wanted, and then they stopped. And then they couldn't sustain their supply lines against multinational attacks, and they pissed off. There we go on the upload limit. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.